in scholarship in general. We will be discussing today Anthropology after Gluckman, the Manchester School, Colonial and Postcolonial Transformation by Professor Richard Werbner, who is Emeritus Professor of Anthropology at University of Manchester. We have four distinguished discussants of the book who will be discussing different aspects of the book, different chapters. The first is Professor Dame Marilyn Strathern, Emeritus Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Cambridge, who I'm proud to say was my teacher at Cambridge. Professor Adam Kuper, visiting professor at Boston University and at the LSE. We also have Professor Richard Fardon, Emeritus Professor of West African Anthropology at SOAS, and Dr. Sakkie Niehaus, who is at Brunel University, London. So we have a distinguished cast this afternoon, and I'm very happy to welcome all of our discussants and the author, Professor Richard Werbner. And I thank you all for coming. I think this is perhaps one of the best attended seminars we've ever had at the center, especially in this era of online seminars. I think a particular description of the Manchester School on page 2 of this book also constitutes a fitting description of the author and the four accomplished scholars that we are hosting today. Can you please stop your camera and your microphone if you're not one of the presenters, please? Thank you. So I was saying that I think a particular description of the Manchester School in page 2 of this book constitutes also a fitting description of the author and the four accomplished scholars that we are hosting today. And this is, and I'll quote this description. Among the lessons to be learned from the work of the Manchester School is endurance, to keep on meeting the need for rethinking in our subject in the light of sustained and intense fieldwork and with an informed understanding of where we come from. I think this is also a fitting description of the 5 scholars who will be speaking today. How we would proceed today, we'll have about 15 minutes discussion of the book, general line book from the author, Professor Werbner, and then we would have 10 minutes discussion of the book by the 4 discussants, and then Professor Werbner will respond, and thereafter will open. Please join me in welcoming the author and the discussants, and we start with Professor Richard. Thank you.
Richard, you're still muted.
You have to unmute yourself.
Again. So I'll start again. Okay? Am I all right? Can you hear me, Wally? I can't.
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay, good.
Yes, I
well,
can.
Let me start again. Thank you, Wally, for bringing us all together virtually and for giving us this chance to address an interested, international, interdisciplinary, and wide audience. I'm told that ultimately it's going to be more than 200 in attendance. And with Wally, I have the feeling of coming back into the fold. Terence Ranger, Wally's most distinguished predecessor, gave me the benefit of much collaboration in our convening conferences and publishing volumes together, and in our decades-long argument about who really was right about Wally, the high god. I think he knows now the answer, but I don't know yet. He's the one who did so much as a public intellectual to fight against everything your chair, Wally, your chair's donor stood for. Let's call it decolonization if we want to, but together let us be thankful for Terence Ranger's tradition in this seminar. My thanks too go to Brenda McCollum, who's done so much to provide the essential backup for this seminar. Today we have the opportunity to engage in a roast. It'll be a critical discussion of anthropology after Gluckman, my book recently published in hardback and ebook by Manchester University Press, and later this year to be published in paperback. And allow me to say, as my father's son, that if you wish, you can call for a 30% discount from Manchester University Press and enter the code newsletter30. And that'll apply, I think, also to the paperback. I want to thank Adam, Sakkie, Marilyn, and Richard, not only for being willing to share their insights today, but for when they read and commented so helpfully on chapters in drafts. I thank them all for challenging me to rethink and write better so that our coming generation of anthropologists may gain in their sense of where we've come from and why that might matter for their distinctively own ways forward in 20th century anthropology. Being well over 6 foot tall, Max Gluckman used to boast that he was a pygmy, fond of standing on the shoulders of a giant, the better to see further than the giant himself. To me, what writing this book and now returning for reflection means is passing on a torch between, above all, ethnographers. There's a promise. It is that some small light still present from our past might return enough hopeful illumination for deep dialogue to be creative in these dark times of ours. Let me offer a general introduction to the book. Before, I believed Adam was to be the first, but I hope you'll stick to that if you don't mind, Wally. Before Adam puts a fresh perspective on it, and I ask him to give his sure grasp on my book's story of Max Gluckman and to make it possible so that I don't have to rehearse today much of what I say about Max Gluckman, but you will benefit from the acuteness of insight that Adam will give us. I expect that in turn, each panelist will follow and focus more closely on the significant engagements of one member of Max Gluckman's circle. To complete the circle, I'll carry my general remarks in this introduction forward to comment on contributions made by Elizabeth Colson. And if you have the picture, Brenda, maybe you should show that now. Could you do that? Brenda, hi?
Yeah, just a second. I'm
Just a sec.
cueing it now.
Contributions by Elizabeth Colson. There she is in the field, and we'll see and hear more about her. And Clyde Mitchell. This book is an experiment in bringing together intellectual history. We can turn off the screen there and maybe focus on me if I'm bold enough, Brenda. This book is an experiment in bringing together intellectual history and social biography. And I want to acknowledge from the start that I'm able to carry this approach forward because I build on the monumental and intimately informed biography of Gluckman by Robert Gordon. And I much recommend those people who want to know about Gluckman with a lot of gossip and very close understanding to read Robert Gordon's biography. My own aim is more after Gluckman, and the after is happily ambiguous, like the post in Postcolonial. Not a simple linear turn. After Gluckman, if after in time, is so in influence and example, in hot pursuit to catch up, in approach, in reaction, and so forth. More broadly, it is to enable coming generations of anthropologists to engage critically and perhaps joyfully with certain living legacies of modern anthropology. I want us to join together in asking this: how do 21st century developments fit into or depend on the great transformation from our colonial past into our post-colonial present? What kind of knowledge are we passing on? As an intellectual history, Anthropology after Gluckman tells of intense, argument-rich collaborations and dissensions among Gluckman's inner circle that came to be known as the Manchester School. As a social biography, the book focuses on each primary subject as a member of a circle of persons powerfully significant for one another and intensely engaged with the leading member, Max Gluckman himself. Each circle member was my friend, and with the exception of Elizabeth Colson, my teacher and colleague also. I never met John Barnes, and for the lack of first-hand knowledge, I say all too little about his important work. There's something of a human comedy in this Manchester School circularity, of course. And I have to say, as a pupil and an insider close to Max Gluckman over the last decades of his life, that the fact is, our human comedy was often much enjoyed and taken to be full of funny antics, delighting us, the members ourselves, even after or when we gritted our teeth. My own analysis reveals that members of the circle did engage in deep dialogue, enduring friendships, and counterposed creativity, their apparent intent being to collaborate, and yet not to trespass, so to speak, on the other's perceived domains, such as the extended case method and its application to the study of conflict resolution. They were, in my view, mavericks who claimed among themselves not a unity in research interests or theoretical assumptions, but evolving conversations across disciplines and highly personal directions. The rediscovery of the complexity of their engagement as well as their impact illuminates an exploration of the frontiers between ethnography, the sociology of knowledge, and the anthropology of colonial to post-colonial change, and also of cosmopolitanism. Some of the colonial and post-colonial questions that I consider in this book are about the past critique of power and coercion and the aftermath of struggles for liberation. Even further, I address another significant part of the knowledge needed in our troubled times. This has to grasp the vulnerability of anthropologists ourselves and the risks we endure in research on politically sensitive issues, even apparently mundane and everyday matters. And this is the point that I think Wale has appreciated already, that it's a strength continuing from our past, that we remain committed to anthropology and intensive fieldwork, despite becoming prohibited immigrants or unwittingly being caught in the crossfire of conflict, disturbing, undoing, or completely stopping our research. Yes, among the lessons to be learned from the works of the Manchester School is, I believe, endurance, and hopefully its resilience also. It is to keep on meeting the need for rethinking in our subject, as I argued, and that is in the light of sustained, intimate, and intense fieldwork, and with an informed understanding of how and where we have come from. Now, a great deal of ink has been spilt on the question of the so-called schoolness of the Manchester School, and especially its customary focus on conflict, its house style, and its sophisticated, indeed innovative research methods. It has grown to be a scholarly industry that was much fostered, indeed very deliberately, and with a strong grasp of popular communication by Max Gluckman himself. And it includes my own early account in the Annual Review of Anthropology 1984. In this early account, I reported alternative perspectives, that of an outsider and that of an insider. I found it was an outsider, Mary Douglas, who, in a review that was first to salute, as she put it, the emergence of a school of anthropology whose publications are developed through close discussion and where each worker's work is enhanced by his focus on a common stock of problems. By contrast, I reported from the insider's perspective the view of my own fieldwork supervisor, Clyde Mitchell, who told me, seen from the outside, the Manchester School was a school, but seen from the inside, it was a seething contradiction, and perhaps the only thing we had in common was that Max was our teacher, and that meant we wrote ethnography, rich in actual cases. If the insider's perspective was one thing, and the outsider's another, so too was the criticism a matter of, to use a favorite Manchester notion, situational selection. The insiders prided themselves on intense argument, and direct, open criticism with each other and their works in progress explicitly in seminars, perhaps not like this one with a huge horde around us. But in public and publications, disagreements sometimes appeared frank, though usually more respectful than in seminar confrontations. Of course, as I take care to show in the book, the flow of frank, judgmental, and telling gossip among the insiders was remarkable, as could be expected from the analysis in Manchester Gossip Studies. As for the outsiders, it was Mary Douglas who took on the role of being a prosecutor or unavoidable nemesis. Douglas praised or she damned in subsequent reviews, monograph after monograph of the Manchester School. And for this reason, among others, I comment in my book at some length on her considerable importance for the Manchester School, and in particular for the interpretation of Victor Turner's work. Admittedly, I have a hobby horse of my own, and here I ride it at some length in the book, particularly in carrying forward my long-term debts and engagement with Victor Turner's work. I try to put this in perspective of a series of strategies for destabilizing ethnography. One strategy is under the rubric of deconstruction, another under that of redescription, and reanalysis is my own joy and hobby horse, and the one, I have to say, most cultivated by Gluckman himself. As for deconstruction, I'm well aware that after Derrida, literary critics see and disagree under that rubric with regard to many things and approaches about which I'm not competent to speak. I'm taking the license to apply deconstruction to a destabilizing strategy which had its heyday following publication of Writing Culture. Deconstruction is above all the critical uncovering of concealment in the text of an ethnography, hidden through rhetoric, through the appealing style of writing, through the seductive, often apparently simple and realistic narrative voice of the writer, are presuppositions, in particular about power and inequality. As Pnina Werbner reminds us, the deconstructive critiques of the newer in Writing Culture seem to liberate the reader from politically significant complicity, unwitting entanglement in colonial domination disguised or glossed over. Ethnographers felt the challenges first to interrogate political bias in their own text as well as in anthropological classics, and in so doing to effect a critique of their own culture and its narrative arts for collusion in domination of others. So overwhelming did this interrogation trend become that it led many to something like a failure of nerve, with doubt about whether ethnography, especially writing, but also research in fieldwork, was still credible and valid or even possible. The destabilizing strategy of redescribing, like deconstruction, aims against concealment and for some liberation. Unlike deconstruction, however, redescribing turns away from power and inequality to a concern for displacement. What is it that has to be displaced? Or perhaps exercised? As Roy Wagner would have it, and I quote, "The future of Western society lies in its ability to create social forms that will make distinctions between classes and segments of society, so that these distinctions do not come of themselves as implicit racism, discrimination, corruption, crisis, riots, necessary cheating and finagling, and so on. The future of anthropology lies in its ability to exorcise difference and make it conscious and explicit." I cite this passage particularly because of its signal significance in the development of redescribing. Marilyn Strathern places it on the flyleaf of the gender of the gift to indicate a starting point for her own first contribution in a major and comparative work of redescribing. Wagner was not himself given to describing. It was, of course, for the future. Hence, reading his Invention of Culture in about 1978, well before Writing Culture, was, I quote, like a door opening, unquote, for Marilyn Strathern. Her remarkable body of many richly varied studies now gives the most productive and substantial, if individual and often highly personal, examples of actually redescribing ethnography. How these bear the sterling hallmark of redescribing is intricately revealed in the reflexive accounts and interviews, the debates and commentaries, especially on ways of rethinking and reimagining sociality, in Ashley Leibner's illuminating collection, Redescribing Relations. I refer the reader and the full audience here to it as a whole, while I regard a very small part of it in the book Anthropology after Gluckman. Marilyn Strathern, in my view, has a gift of redescribing that appears to be paradoxical, intensely serious, and sometimes at once deliberately and admittedly playful and tricky. It is a gift of argument and narrative, and you'll see in chapter 5 that I take up the substantial question of any dialogue around relational thought and social relations that might be or might have been sustained between Strathern and members of the Manchester School in their concern with the development of social network analysis. Above all, redescribing turns to awaken consciousness of premises, to call for the unexamined to be examined, for constructs not to be taken for granted. It is no good going on pretending, for the sake of convenience and analysis, that disparate things are commensurate. If we can't avoid the use of fictions in analysis, we have to be vigilant in learning how they may be rooted in Western metaphysics, and in letting readers be clear about the fictional problematics involved. For Strathern, redescribing is something of a wake-up call to reflect on how accounts deploy fundamental oppositions, we might say so-called common sense logic, in appearing to be cogent, notably by contrast to deconstruction's destructive force, its unnerving of ethnographers with critical and self-doubt about ethnography, redescribing in its destabilizing of ethnography has elicited an efflorescence known to Marilyn Strathern's credit as the new Melanesian ethnography. Now, by comparison to both deconstruction and redescribing, reanalysis is hardly novel. That is, in good measure because it shares very simply with much academic practice in puzzling about what is mistaken in a text, an argument, or received analysis. In such practice, reanalysis is pragmatic on the creative way to ethnographic renewal. The appeal is this: hunt for the mistake, track it down, and crucial in such detection, perhaps most fun, is the recovery for purposes of further creativity of both the accidental and the missing. The accidental could be a bit of fieldwork, observation, information, or odd data, not integral to the argument or explanation of the ethnographer, and apparently unimportant, but given in the ethnography for the sake of a more complete record. The missing is not assumed, as in deconstruction, to be kept out or silenced in the service of power and domination. Instead, to be learned through reanalysis is how and why the missing is missing. Sometimes it gets recognized in comparison from one ethnography to others, and along with the accidental becomes at once destabilizing and constructive in further learning as to where a theoretical orientation constitutes blinkers and bias in ethnography. So far, to my knowledge, the engagement with theory in reanalysis has avoided coming to terms with a boldly philosophical drive, as in redescribing rooted in Western metaphysics or in the foundational ideas and oppositions of, what's a fiction, Euro-Americans. Instead, more within the workman-like practice familiar in academic scholarship, reanalysis does advance debate by pitching one theoretical tradition against another, as well as by arguing within the frame of a theoretical orientation for mistakes or shortcomings in the construction of an account. At the heart of my reanalysis, which I hope Richard Fardon will take up and maybe tear apart in Chapter 9, on Victor Turner's masterpiece, Chihamba, the White Spirit, I address questions of perspectival ethnography and of the extent to which Turner's familiar ideas on performance, liminality, semiotics, and the ritual process do shed light on Chihamba as a ritual drama. My account speaks to a new 21st century generation of reflexive ethnographers. To close the distance between them is an aim of mine, and to have recognized the radical experiments in perspectival plurality that 20th century ethnographies advanced. Given these general remarks, let me turn now to my portraits of some members of the Gluckman circle. And here, if Brenda will help me, you can see again Elizabeth Colson's picture in the midst of others, perhaps in a dispute, but very, very much the sense of how intimate one could understand of Elizabeth Colson's work and of her appreciation of what she had to learn from Tonga. So I'll start with discussing her work and then come to Clyde Mitchell. Elizabeth Colson was Max Gluckman's successor as head of the Rhodes Livingston Institute, and she was the only one of the circle who was not his pupil, and indeed not a pupil of Radcliffe Brown or of Malinowski. In a chapter on her life and work, I seek to show how and why her legacy, so rich in Central African ethnography, matters for coming generations of anthropologists. Colson came from a Midwestern town in Minnesota, distinguished by the uneasy coexistence of displaced Ojibwa Indians and white settler farmers. I believe this origin predisposed Colson towards concerns with discrimination, emplacement, and displacement, towards egalitarianism and participatory democracy, and towards being a systems skeptic. By this I mean a skeptic who casts doubt on the utility of any model of a system as if it was something consistently well integrated as a totality, whether a social system or a cultural system. Her system skepticism led her to write essays on the Tonga, which focus on what Marilyn Strathern might well consider, I hope, to be partial connections. Her skepticism stands out against the approaches of other pioneering social anthropologists, her influential contemporaries Max Gluckman and his respected seniors Edward Evans Pritchard and Maya Fortis. I share the judgment offered by Emrys Peters, my old colleague, who wrote to the chair of her appointment committee for her professorship at Berkeley. And here, of course, one is nibbling away at the archives to read things that were not intended for my eyes, but there you are. She was the only social anthropologist in the late 1940s and early 1950s who was making a distinctive theoretical breakaway in social anthropology. Her fame as one of the foremost anthropologists engaged in the critical understanding of human problems owes much to her late career research from the mid-1950s onwards on forced change among Gwembe Valley Tonga in Zambia. Among her many essays, one of my favorites is her ethics chapter on heroism, martyrdom, courage in 1971. It shows her playful touch, perhaps less well known than her successful activism for equality and her breaking through more than one set of glass ceilings. Esteemed by Tonga, a true man of virtue, she points out, turned out to be readier to resist domination or intimidation, not by standing up to it, but by running away. Danger past, he would come home. The essay was presented in a festschrift to Evans Pritchard, hence illuminating such masculinity was ironic and perhaps intentionally mischievous, a contrast Colson implied not only to heroic Nuer, but to the spellbinding tales of his own Second World War exploits that Evans Pritchard famously told in Oxford pubs, perhaps still resonating in Oxford now, about being the bush irregular and Bimbashi sergeant for heroic raids in the Sudan. I argue that if we seek to grasp what made and still makes even Colson's very first monograph on the Makah Indians a recognized classic, we find it in her ability to get us to share her fascination with actual practice, the love of gossip, for example, and to get us to recognize, perhaps in a convex mirror, a human comedy in which we too can be intimately placed. In good measure, I read her early Makah Indian work as a narrative study, paving the way for my own regard in Tears of the Dead for the Rashomon effect, the ways an event is told in contradictory stories by individual witnesses from different viewpoints. I'm tempted to claim that the Makah Indians is a postmodernist work, or at least that in its turn to the Rashomon effect, it's more postmodern than modern. For much of her career, I highlight the importance of her bridging American sociology and British and American anthropology for crucial exchanges in their development. She argued that Manchester owed more to American sociology than to American anthropology. Particularly during the beginnings of the Manchester School, she made, along with John Barnes and Clyde Mitchell, very deliberate efforts leading to network analysis, about which I'm going to say more soon. Together with Mitchell and Barnes, Colson established connections with Kurt Lewin's field theory and Gestalt psychology and Jacob Moreno's approach to sociometry. Even further, for small group sociology, she got Gluckman to invite George Homans to Manchester, and Homans's impact was considerable, as I indicate. In anthropology after Gluckman, I turned from rural research by the hometown anthropologist Colson to urban research by Clyde Mitchell, whose lack of a hometown in his early life and his need to learn the numbers on railway timetables, his Scottish father worked on the South African Railway, may well have been formative for a lifelong disposition. It was to following people newly on the move, especially strangers encountering fresh situations and innovating in towns. Arguably, Mitchell's formative disposition appears to be dual, both an affinity with mapping, navigating, and finding the way through flux and complexity, and also a fascination with empirical bits of the kind a mathematician might pass. One assumption might seem hard to contest, that anthropology deeply honors our shared humanity, the more we shed light on how, in the face of adversity, people still celebrate living, fun, joy, playful creativity, even people showing off how smartly they can dress. The fact is that precisely for illuminating all that in his study of the Kalela dance in colonial Zambia, then northern Rhodesia, Clyde Mitchell came under fierce attack, indeed an ad hominem polemic, even against Mitchell's personal motives, from the South African sociologist Bernard Magubane. It was at that time when the affinity between rising nationalism and the liberation struggle in Africa seemed more certain than it now does.
Richard, you've been muted. Just for a second.
Yeah.
You're still muted.
Okay.
Is that
Yes.
okay?
There we go.
Okay now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know where I lost us, but let me just go back to Magubane, that Magubane had the moral authority of a prominent African National Congress activist in the forefront of the campaign against disinvestment from South Africa. He drew on this moral authority to the point of belittling the thrust of the American civil rights movement. And we should keep this well in mind as we now are engaged in our own kinds of polarization. Magubane had a meta-narrative about class and race with a strong thesis of imperial economic domination and disempowerment, which allowed no room for such relational and processual concepts as the social situation and the social field. Worse still, Magubane apparently perceived that what we would call speaking for, that is, to be a white social scientist claiming expertise on Africa, was in itself suspect, and to focus on interpersonal relations and everyday life was to be opening all the more the charge of hiding the class struggle and being an agent, perhaps unwittingly, of quite white supremacy. Aware of the serious resonance with the renewed debate about decolonization and indigenous knowledge, I try to spell out certain implications for urban ethnographic research of the trenchant would-be Marxist critique in Magubane's polemic. In one chapter, I follow the development by Mitchell, along with Bill Epstein, of their approach to social and cultural innovation and change in Copperbelt towns. In the foreground is Epstein's analysis of urban Africans' continuous struggle for power and improved positions within the new industrial society. More broadly on that basis, I devote a major part of the discussion to problems of engaged and contested social science in the eye of the storm. And here I show how, for Mitchell, engaged anthropology was public anthropology, which takes critical stands on pressing social and political issues, including academic freedom. On this basis, I examine the turn by A.L. Epstein, Clyde Mitchell, and others to relational thought, at first primarily about ties of friendship or kinship, and about the structure of these ties. I think I'll jump a little bit because I'm worried about the time. Sorry, let me. They were led by John Barnes and later Mitchell to foster an approach to science through mathematics. After Barnes, Mitchell reformulated mathematical concepts in sociological language and brought graph theory and algebraic ideas and methods to bear on the data of interpersonal relations. Now, what is of some interest is that this really pioneering part of Manchester School has come to be at the center of a huge growth industry, the field of social network analysis. Mitchell saw the turn to network analysis as a theoretical move away from a form of structural functionalism and toward an approach which apparently, quote, provided a coherent and systematic framework into which all the daily activities of people and their relationships with one another could be fitted. Even further, in empirical terms, he saw it to be a turn driven by the problematics of moving from the study of so-called classical tribal society, highly localized on the small scale, to studies of what he called more complex societies, especially urban, large-scale ones. But it's worth taking account of the fact that Barnes himself saw the making of the turn somewhat differently. It was located within a longer tradition of thought in social anthropology, responsive to the complex phenomena of kinship in so-called classical tribal societies. And he argued, Barnes did, it was linked to the problematics of disparate or overlapping relations in the social fields of such a society, as in Maya Fortis's seminal accounts of clanship and kinship among Talensi. He wrote, Barnes did, the idea of the network was an idea I picked up from my elders, principally from Fortis's book, The Web of Kinship. I used it to describe how notions of class equality were applied and how individuals made use of personal ties of kinship and friendship in Bremnes, a community in Norway. End of quotation. Barnes cautioned on the need for care in adopting terminology and concepts from topology and graph theory, and he tried to sort out ideas of connectedness and connectivity. What Mitchell and Epstein shared in their turn to what came to be known as a social network analysis was a heightened concern for certain specifically innovative aspects of modern life in urban Africa. It was their awareness of choice-making that in the face of urban complexity and uncertainties, individuals often felt the need to maneuver, negotiate, and even manipulate others, especially friends, acquaintances, and often kin or conjugal partners. I stress individual because of the importance that recognition of individuals as particular persons had in the Mitchell and Epstein turn to social network analysis. Initially, at least, they had in mind the new urban dwellers of Zambia, finding their townways in recently created new towns, not the ancient communities in Africa, not towns with a profusion of voluntary associations, as in many West African cities. I think that I won't dare, as I'd intended, to give something of a summary of some work that I present in the book to show how their influence led me to research on elites and prominent cosmopolitans in Botswana. And I hope that some of you who will be reading the book will take that up and see how it might have some relevance, particularly I know that Wally himself is working on. So with this point about Botswana, I reach my own favorite comfort zone. And in this discussion of elites, I want to say that it's been a real pleasure to think about it a little bit with you. And I want to turn safely to another substantial ethnographer of transformation in Botswana. And I want to welcome Adam Kuper, if I may say that he come before Marilyn, because I think it'll fit the order, if you'll forgive me, Wally. And so I hope that Adam Kuper will take a grip of the story that I present of Max Gluckman and shake us all up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dick, for that excellent introduction to the book. Although a little, took about a few minutes more than allocated, but that's fine. Thank you for the excellent introduction to the book. So we would, the order of the responses would be Professor Adam Kuper will first give the first response. He will give an overview of the first few chapters. Then Dr. Niehaus would speak to the chapter on Max Gluckman and talk about the South African context. And then Professor Marilyn Strathern will speak to chapter 7 on Epstein. And then Professor Richard Fardon will speak to chapter 8 on Victor Turner. And then there will be a brief response from Professor Werbner. Professor Kuper?
Thank you very much. What I'm going to try and do is give something of a group portrait of the original Manchester School. I have certain nervousness about this because when I first tried this nearly 50 years ago in a book on what was then called British social anthropology, it provoked a very, very angry reaction from Max himself. And it made me wonder really why. What was it that caused such a backlash? And I think that it had to do with the very nature of this Manchester School. And the Manchester School at the time was very nicely described by Mary Douglas, although she didn't mention it in this context, in her contrast, in her essays on grid and group, in her contrast between different kinds of ideological, theoretical, social, political organizations, which she mapped largely on a contrast between church and chapel, not to say sect. And that is something which I think, in Mary's formulation, is a way of understanding the reaction to criticism, the reaction to outside perspectives of the insiders in these kinds of groups. Right, now, in this particular group, of course, it was dominated by this charismatic leader, Max Gluckman. A lot of people were very, very fascinated, engaged by the personality as well as by the ideas. Others were turned off by the personality, liked the ideas, and vice versa. My own first professor of anthropology at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa had been a member of the Manchester School, Max Marwick, and he conveyed to us a very strong ambivalence about the relationship between the man, the group, and the ideas. But I think that the key to understanding the Manchester group, the early stages, is to understand the relationship of Max Gluckman to the people he recruited around him. Now, Max brought a message from South Africa. He was formed in a radical milieu at the University of Witwatersrand, a critique of colonial South African race relations, and he took that to the Rhodes Livingston Institute, and he also brought that to Manchester. That was his framework, and that was also involved a critique of a lot of the orthodoxies of what was then British social anthropology. The ideas that you were dealing with tribal societies which were stable, which were homogeneous, that were without history and without much built-in kind of conflict. All these ideas were very much challenged by Max and his Manchester group. The other part of the question is, well, who did he attract? Who did he bring together? And the answer, I'm sorry, I'm getting an echo now. I hope you're not getting that. He brought in young ex-servicemen, largely British ex-servicemen, who were also politically radical, including a number who were in or on the margins of the Communist Party, Watson, Frankenberg, Turner, Worsley, and were very attracted partly by Max's anti-colonial perspective rhetoric and his interest in what he took from South Africa as well, in trying to understand local villages, local communities within a national context, within a power structure that transcended local provinces or tribes, and which had within it a very, very strong component of monopoly capitalism. So this was the idea, and this was the charismatic leader, so that there was the joke at the time, I think Ronnie Frankenberg used to claim it was his, "We are all Maxists here," as a description of the Manchester School in the early days. How did it translate into theory, theoretical and methodological processes? And I think that that was largely done through the seminars, through the seminar system, which was a very strong feature of the Manchester School, and which, as Dick was saying earlier, involves a lot of very aggressive challenges and argument in what was extremely macho, masculine, aggressive environments. I mean, these seminars were very, very difficult for outsiders to cope with. And another feature of this, I think, another result of this, or part of this whole picture, was the virtual exclusion of women. It was an all-male gang. Elizabeth Colson comes in later on the margins, never really part of the Manchester group, just always really secondary. So it was a very masculine group. Dick doesn't like this, it's true. Very masculine group, very aggressive, very, very difficult for outsiders to criticize, or be allowed to criticize and deal with. They also, part of the dynamic was the feeling that they were fighting an orthodoxy, fighting an entrenched establishment within social anthropology in Britain, one that was much more comfortable with the colonial situation than a lot of these people were, and which I think they also associated with a more conservative political stance in general. Okay, so let's look at the ideas. One of the key ideas that I think that they bring in more or less successfully is the idea of process. The idea that ethnographies cannot be just descriptions of static structures. These structures are continually changing and either reinforced or brought to some kind of crisis by processes which are intrinsic to the societies. Not necessarily, of course, they're influenced by outside forces, but within the society itself, there are these forces of division, of conflict, of change, which the societies themselves are grappling with and which have to be dealt with. So change, both on a larger scale, history, but also on a small scale, local conflicts, local challenges, local contradictions, as the Marxists used to say, within these structures and within the systems. These were quite new ideas that they were insisting on. Of course, not unique to this group. There were other sociologists and social theorists, and of course, different kinds of Marxists, which also had similar kinds of critiques, analyses. But nevertheless, this was central to them. And part of this was the emphasis on conflict, that conflict was not unusual. Conflict was actually part and parcel of everyday social life, partly created, structured by built-in problems within the society, difficulties, tensions, strains, and stresses. And that this had to be captured, this led to a methodological conclusion, this had to be captured by focusing on problem cases. The extended case system, which was introduced by Vic Turner and Max Gluckman, was an attempt to capture the way in which these social processes full of conflict worked themselves out again and again, recurrently, sometimes changing the structures in the longer terms. The network analysis, which comes in later, which Dick described in some detail, was another attempt to deal with the idea not of the static structures, which the Radcliffe Brown School had so emphasized, but with the relationships, the changing factional relationships, the comings and goings, the dealings on a local level, which the Manchester School gave a lot, I think correctly, a lot of prominence to. They also, and this was a very, very important contribution, they introduced a new social field for social anthropology in what was then British Africa, a field which had been already pioneered in South African anthropology, which was urban studies, the studies of migrant laborers and even the rising urban bourgeoisie and the trade unions in the cities. This was established in South African anthropology. Max Gluckman and Epstein and Clyde Mitchell bring that to the Copper Belt, bring that to Zambia. Very, very important expansion of the range of things that British social anthropology was engaged in and could study. So this is another aspect of the solidarity of the Manchester School, that the key studies were done in Central Africa. Of course, you had Emrys Peters working in the Middle East. You had Ronnie Frankenberg working in Britain. There were people who were doing other kinds of studies, but nevertheless, they all knew very well a group of case studies in Central Africa, a group of societies. And so when they were discussing the development of ideas and theories, they had a common set of ethnographic references as well, which they didn't know only from books, but from most of them from personal experience. And that greatly enriched the debates and the discussions with them. Now, I think that one of the interesting features of the group in the later stages was what caused people to break away. What caused these very, very troubled secessions, and particularly of two of the central figures of the early days, Victor Turner, who I think we would generally agree was the outstanding ethnographer and in some ways theorist in this cohort, and Peter Worsley, who made the big break within Manchester, leading a secession of sociology away from the social anthropologists. And I think that Mary Douglas would say, well, that sort of fission is inevitable given this kind of chapel structure which Max Gluckman had built and developed. Right, I think I'll end there. I hope I don't get into as much trouble this time as I did 50 years ago when I first described what I understood to be the Manchester Group.
Thank you very much, Professor Kuper. We'll now move to Dr. Isaac Hills, who will discuss Max Gluckman and the South African context.
Right. You can all see me, can you?
Yes.
Okay. I would like to share some ideas, not about after Gluckman, but ideas about what happened before Gluckman. Now, we all know that Gluckman brought various theoretical innovations to the discipline, such as his emphasis on both the scientific and the historical, his interest in social structures rather than in culture, and then also the emphasis on regional comparison and the idea of the extended case study as a means to link local events with broader structures. But Gluckman also brought a left liberal kind of orientation and an anti-colonial perspective to anthropology, which might have seemed very attractive at Manchester at that time for a variety of reasons. And this kind of anti-colonial structure viewpoint was evident in his opposition to segregation, in his support of African independence movements, his sympathies with the Mau Mau, and among many other ideas. Now, while I think we have explored many of the theoretical the sources of his theoretical ideas, I think that we haven't really explored the political ideas in the context of this left liberal orientation and the anti-colonial stance. And I would think that there's a long continuous line of thinking and on justice and injustice, which leads to the Manchester School. And it's got its roots in different forms of South African liberalism, I would argue. Now, for me, the crucial moment in South African liberalism, at least in anthropology, is 1905. This was during the British Association for the Advancement of Science, when Alfred Haddon gives a lecture in South Africa. Haddon speaks about the importance of salvaging information on South African people. And his reason for this is that South Africa is a whirlpool of humanity. Some of the tribes still live under the old system. Some of the communities have been destroyed. The authority of chiefs has been diminished. Cattle has been destroyed by the rinderpest epizootic. We find urbanization, the emergence of labor compounds, and he also comments on the Ethiopian church movement. And he said that it is this, we have to understand the customs in this rapidly changing contexts. Now, Haddon was very, very much aware of the changing, of the destructive impact of colonialism, both in Ireland and also on the Torres Straits Islands. And he wrote to Thomas Huxley, it's a quite interesting letter that he wrote. The Anglo-Saxon ruthlessly forces every native into his own Procrustean bed of usage and custom, and is supported by the resources of the imperial army and navy. The result of this policy is that we exterminate, unintentionally or by force, inhabitants of the countries we annex. Ignorance engenders callousness, which is the fertile mother of injustice, cruelty, and legalized murder. And this was said in a letter in 1891. So his idea was then that anthropological knowledge can have a liberatory effect and can ameliorate at least some of the effects of colonialism, if not challenge it. I think Haddon is also important because of the Torres Straits expedition. And that is a determination in the idea of the unity of humankind. And the endless tests conducted in the Torres Straits expedition reported no sensory or cognitive differences between the Torres Straits Islanders and the ordinary English. So the attention then shifts to culture and to social structure. Now, what is interesting is that both Radcliffe Brown and Winifred Hernley were present in the audience. Radcliffe Brown was his secretary, and Winifred Hernley was a young student at the University of Cape Town. Now, Radcliffe Brown was a complex man who was influenced, I would argue, by Piotr Kropotkin, who was the revolutionary anarchist, who said that we need to study society before we can change it, and we have to begin with simpler societies before we begin with the complex society that is England. Radcliffe Brown witnessed the brutalities of colonialism while he did fieldwork in the Andaman Islands and also in Western Australia. The Andaman Islands was populated by 14,000 prisoners and only 1,500 Andamanese. These prisoners were people convicted of mutiny in India. They were also convicted of murder, some of them, and others were convicted of unnatural sexual practices, which is homosexuality. They were flogged in public in the time that he was there. And also the Andaman Islanders had been decimated by European diseases. In the same way, in Western Australia, he arrived after the Punjara massacre of 100 Aboriginals. He witnesses the absolute draconian controls that the police protectors had over the lives of Aboriginal people, and the right even to remove children from parents. And then there was a police posse which disrupted his research. On the island of Tonga, he witnessed the Spanish flu being brought to the island by a ship from, I think originally it was Canada, and 8% of the population died. he helped out to bury the dead on the island of Fiji. And if we look then, when he comes to South Africa, then what he finds is a rapidly urbanizing society, 200,000 African men working in the mines. And he argued in his inaugural lecture that segregation is impossible. We need to build a new society which incorporates white and black, and we need to formulate laws in accordance with the native consciousness. And this was quite revolutionary. It built on Haddon's earlier views, but it also challenged the older segregationist views of people like Henri Junot. Now, Radcliffe Brown is a member of the Joint Council movement, which was a movement of Europeans and Africans in which they together discussed problems such as homelessness. There was condemnation of police brutality. And Jabavu, the leader of the African National Congress at that time, praised him for his unbiased racial outlook. It's quite interesting in his testimony to the Economic and Wage Commission, in which he argues for the creation of more land for Africans, opportunities for advancement. And he says Africans need exactly the same rights as whites once they participate in the same economy. And then if we look at Winifred, so this is the kind of orientation at the University of Cape Town. Winifred Hernley was appointed at Witwatersrand, and then she had studied under Haddon and then also under Durkheim. But what is interesting, I think, is that when she traveled her fieldwork to the Richtersveld and also to what is called Namibia today, she essentially, during her trips, found people brought to Windhoek as prisoners during the war, and they were distributed between various places as much as their labor required. And then she wrote a report on the South African mandate, in which she's very, very critical of the dispossession of land, the way in which arbitrary taxes were imposed on people, and also the way in which people dreamt of the former land holdings, which were now occupied by whites. The kind of students which she attracted were largely liberal students who were who were against the government's policies of segregation, especially the Herzog policies. And there were large numbers of Jewish students. Gluckman's father was a lawyer who defended African clients, and I think Dick has a very beautiful description of his defense of the Birwa people in Botswana. And then Alan Hellman and Hilda Kuper and Jack and Eileen Krieger, who were essentially old supporters of Smuts. The students were involved in things like the council movement. They were involved in NUSAS, the National Union of South African Students, and they also had projects by the South African Institute of Race Relations, such as interviewing beer sellers who were arrested in prison. When Hellman worked on the slums in Johannesburg, there was 109 police arrests out of less than 400 people. And the ideas that they were taught were common values in a society obsessed with racial and cultural difference. It's very interesting that Malinowski comes to South Africa in 1934. He gives a speech at the New Education Conference. There's 2,000 listeners in the Great Hall at Wits. And he pleads for native self-government, and he argues that it's inappropriate to impose European schooling upon Africans who live in tribal conditions. Hernley talks at the same conference, and she says that we have to promote a healthy spirit of South Africanism, that African traditions of kinship bride wealth and age sets can help in constructing the South African new civilization. And she pleads for the fact that children should be taught scientific knowledge. Now, I just want to add, in the end, when Gluckman comes to the United Kingdom, he is influenced by Radcliffe Brown again. And there's just one point I'm going to make. What was interesting is while Radcliffe Brown was in Australia, he wrote an article in which he challenges the idea of the terra nullius, the idea of the empty land, and he argues that Aboriginal people had ownership over the land, and that the Aboriginal hordes acted as a corporation, and that their legal ideas of ownership can be translated into the European legal concepts. And I think that must have been very influential to Gluckman's idea of the universal legal concepts, such as the reasonable man. Radcliffe Brown also challenges the idea of colonialism in a speech on applied anthropology. I want to end with a few notes. I think the South African connection is very important to Manchester. Not just Clyde Mitchell, but there were visits by Hilda Kuper, but there were John and Jean Komaroff was on the staff, David Webster taught, and it's a kind of notion where anthropological issues have very serious political kind of consequences. I also think that there's an idea that Dick writes in the book where Gluckman said, keep your eyes and your ears open and your mouth shut. And the idea is that just because people had their eyes and ears open and their mouths shut did not mean that they were not witnessing injustices and colonial brutalities, and they spoke out against it when they had the opportunity to do so. So I think there's a long line, at least, of anti-colonial activism before Gluckman. That's it.
Thank you very much, Sakkie, for that excellent intervention. Now we'll move to Professor Marilyn. Marilyn? Brenda, can you please check?
Yeah, I'll check to see if she's in the participants still.
Oh, okay, she's there.
Yeah.
All right. Please turn on your microphone. Your microphone.
Yes.
Good.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me now.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I have bigger problems. However, I've got a solution. I'm delighted to be part of Manchester in Oxford. Indeed, a reminder, of course, that we're discussing not what happened to the Manchester department after Gluckman's inaugural chairmanship, but the intellectual trajectory of the Manchester School. And Richard, if I may, is telling us that its life had unexpected continuities and implications for any macro history of anthropology. In his conclusion, an overview of the book, Richard pauses on chapter 7 as a turning point in his exposition, dwelling generously on one of Gluckman's first two students, Bill Epstein, who openly challenged the great teacher. Epstein's rebellions, seemingly without conflict or rancor, throw light on the internal heterogeneity of interests that flourished under Gluckman. It is as they're spelt out in chapter 7 that is my interest here. It's too easy to say that Dick has given us a processual account of the intermeshing ideas and personalities that formed the Manchester School. Yet rather than assuming how those in one another's workspaces make themselves into some kind of social entity, he gives a wonderful portrait of the dynamism that kept people within an orbit of common problems that also encouraged them to develop their own contributions. There's Elizabeth Colson's description of a pub conversation between Bill Epstein and Vic Turner on social drama. Or as Richard describes from the vantage of hindsight, Epstein's turn to relational thought in the company of Clyde Mitchell and their urban interlocutors. Every portrait is also a multiple portrait, and the whole is a priceless record of a social milieu. So, Bill Epstein confined to one chapter. What then is his role in chapter 7? Of all his students, Epstein most closely followed Gluckman's work on legal systems. Richard, engaged with the history he's writing, offers a critical comment on Epstein's 1967 paper on the case method in the field of law. Its significance, of course, is the iconic status that the extended case method had in the Manchester School's emerging sense of what it was. Where Richard advocates a clear distinction between the case study method and cases assembled in the courts, Epstein seems to have been imprinting the one on the other. Anyway, Richard records how Epstein built up his own approach, sometimes rehearsing and sometimes revising Gluckman's arguments. In the 1967 paper, Epstein rehearses that analytical personage that so elated Gluckman when discovered in Barozzi jurisprudence, namely the reasonable man, given the conflicting demands of social life, how in any particular situation might a reasonable person act. 5 years later, in 1973, came revision, and the controversy forms an internal turning point of chapter 7 itself. Epstein, Richard observes, thought his teacher had confused things. The ambiguity that split Gluckman's concept into two, being reasonable, covered both fairness and plausibility, involved another split between analytical usage derived from Western jurisprudence and otherwise unremarked folk concepts influencing the way court decisions went. What Richard makes the pivotal moment. Sorry, my cursor is just jumping around. Forgive me for a moment. What Dick makes the pivotal moment of his account then was no less than the controversy that characterized much of 20th century anthropology, the role of ethnography in the derivation of analytical insight. Now, Epstein's challenge included reanalysis of one of Gluckman's famous cases. Richard doesn't mince his words. He thinks Epstein made a hash of it. His undoing, Richard says, lay in distinctions that oversimplified and stripped away complexity, missing thereby the crux of the judge's dilemmas. Richard goes over the central issue in the case at hand and finds what is now Epstein's rejection of the reasonable man as a judicial yardstick a volte-face from his earlier position. Now, this isn't cited as the genesis of a significant theoretical rift. Apparently, Epstein's revisionism had little impact on anyone, but as a harbinger of a greater departure from Gluckman's concerns. That is at once radical in Richard's eyes and the harbinger itself of one trajectory for the subject as a whole, the anthropology of affect, in the figure of Epstein, who was still recognizably a Manchester man. In moving to Melanesia and the Tolai and their adjudications in what was then called dispute settlement, Epstein saw what was missing, that's Richard's words, from Gluckman's framework, the force of emotional dynamics. And this was, of course, part of Epstein's developing interest in psychoanalysis. I would add that the forensic use of emotional expressions, the significance of their display or concealment, their witness to injury, was also there in Epstein's interest in Tolai conventions, including appeals to compassion when it came to the public airing of conflict. Now, in his overview, Richard returned to an earlier moment. Reflection on Epstein and Mitchell's urban work ends with reference to a fascinating thesis about possible connections between Mancunian network analysis and what has since been identified as Melanesianist relationalism. Of course, relationality, let alone relational thinking, wasn't an object of debate at the time, so any correlation is posed retrospectively, thereby, of course, also creating the objects being correlated. But it does raise the question about the tools of self-consciousness with which groups of scholars regard themselves as engaged in, say, intellectual exchange or productive conversations, and leave trails of those encounters. Richard could not have written his own very fascinating account of these Mancunian persons and their communications had academic debate not generated recoverable trails and markers. That said, there's an obvious dimension to anthropology after Gluckman that working from records alone could never have generated. The work is infused by Richard's intimate knowledge of these actors, and in the writing of it, by his own engagement with and immersement in their worlds. More than describing their interactions, he is, in a manner of speaking, continuing them in like manner with his own interjections and criticisms. But he sees certain aspects from the viewpoint of contemporary discourse, keeps older concerns alive by continuing investment, not simply bringing them into the present, but using present events to eliminate them. That is, future things had to happen before past events could again be understood. There are other horizons, of course, as the chapters on post-colonial realities elegantly convey. But let me conclude with a note about one of Richard's interjections. It's also evoked by what he tells of Elizabeth Colson's paradox, circle around past predicaments and old dilemmas while dismissing our forebears' efforts in the matter. Regarding Epstein's reanalysis of the case that had led to Gluckman's discovery of the reasonable man, Richard offers his own interpretation of the largesse of that concept. The judge was able to take into account a personal misfortune that compelled the accused to act. Affect, in the form of compassion, is surely implied, as Epstein himself later noted. Now, I wonder what role Richard's thinking and writing about Epstein's later attention to compassion played in his reappraisal of this controversy. Did the later Epstein have to happen before Gluckman could be heard again? Now, Richard's answer to Colson runs through his book, Rediscovery. Yet what appears rediscovery for the thinker must inevitably be restaged by the writer. And I'm just curious about the writerly strategies here. But in any event, thank you for writing this, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Strathern, for that thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure that Professor Werbner is eager to respond to some of those questions later. Now, we'll listen to...
Many thanks for Marilyn.
Okay. Now we'll listen to Professor Richard Fardon.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Dick and Oxford, for inviting me to say some words about Dick's new book. It's been a pleasure to read parts of it and to be invited to speak on two of its chapters. And I wondered when Dick invited me why he wanted me to look at two chapters, and indeed why the two chapters were as they were. The first one I want to talk to is the chapter devoted to Victor Turner and his work. And the second one, which might almost seem out of place in the book, is a detailed reanalysis of Turner's analysis of Chihamba, the White Spirit. And it's the only reanalysis of that sort of length, I think, in the entire book. And so, of course, I wondered to myself, what was Dick up to? And knowing Dick as I do, I knew there would be both a serious purpose and probably a little bit of mischief afoot as well. Adam remarked earlier that the Manchester School in some ways could be seen by some observers, at least, as having certain sectarian qualities, a very strong external barrier with lots of resistance to leaving. And he noted that Vic Turner was one of those who did leave. And a lot of Dick's account of Vic Turner is concerned with the dynamics of that leaving, which is why the chapter is described as a voyage. And in relation to each of the portraits that Dick gives us, there's a little bit of ventriloquism afoot. A little bit of the personality of the person that he's talking about seems to seep into Dick's reaction to them. And I find that particularly in relation to Vic Turner. And when I read the chapter for the first time, I thought to myself, this is a little bit of a hatchet job, Dick. But Dick's a kindly soul, and so I knew it wouldn't be an unkind hatchet job. So I had in mind one of those sort of squeezy rubber hatchets that go squeak and don't really hurt if you hit anybody with them, or don't hurt too much anyway. What Dick does in the chapter in both of the chapters, is to emphasize the importance of the order in which things happen, which of course is a terribly simple point, but that's part of the common thread of the two chapters. In relation to Vic Turner, there's also a theme running through it. And coincidentally, I was editing one of Franz Steiner's aphorisms for a book today, and the aphorism is actually rather appropriate to the message Dick has in this chapter on Vic Turner. The aphorism runs like this: what becomes of a presentiment? It becomes certainty. And if it was wrong, it still becomes certainty. And if nothing occurs that the presentiment predicted, and nothing is true that it assumes, it still becomes certainty. And there's something of that in Dick's account of Victor Turner, that basically Victor Turner goes down a particular pathway. Very little of what Victor Turner goes looking for there turns out, especially in the later stages of the journey, to be based upon assumptions, presuppositions that are correct, or things turning out as they're supposed to, but nonetheless the presentiment becomes certainty. So let's have a quick look at the itinerary as he sketches it out. Dick notices that, so if I refer to Dick as Dick, it's because I'm Richard and this makes things clearer for both of us. Turner undertook field work twice, between 1950 to 1952, and again between 1953 and 1954. If you add it all up, it's just in excess of 2 years. He never went back to Central Africa after that. And when Dick asked him why not, Turner responded on the lines of, because I would simply find more of what I'd found already, which is a very striking image of the way in which an experience gets sort of concretized in somebody's mind, to the degree that even if they went back, the idea that they would discover anything other than what they'd already found seems to be rather foreign to their way of looking at it. From 1961 to 1983, Turner occupied a series of positions in Palo Alto, Cornell, Chicago, and Virginia, never returning to make a home in the United Kingdom. Looking at the most productive period of Turner's career, Dick suggests that this occurred pretty much between 1957 and 1963, at least in terms of the dates at which things were written. The most productive decade gives us the essays on symbols, the essay on Moshona, the essay on color classification, the early ideas of liminality, and so on and so forth. By the early 60s in the US, Vic Turner is going off into other sorts of interests, which by the middle of the 1960s will find him talking about structure and communitas and looking at things in a binary way. And Dick emphasizes that binary thinking, or contrapuntal, dialectical, however different formulations he gives it, this type of thinking is common to Gluckman and to Turner, but in Turner's later thought it really becomes rather unnuanced, and almost anything can manage to get tipped into an opposition between structure and communitas. The earlier part of the Turner oeuvre is particularly closely associated with what Dick sees as the enduring values, or my reading of what I think he sees as the more enduring values of the Manchester School. It's very close to the ethnography. It has a lot to do with the intrinsic tensions between matrilineality and virilocality, with recurrent episodes in villages which can tear them asunder, but which lead to breaches in order, the sort of thing Adam was talking about earlier, but in most cases are handled through mechanisms which lead to a degree at least of continuity in terms of basic process. Okay, so I'm not going to go into structure and liminality, liminoid states and so on and so forth, because Dick is not terribly sympathetic to those, and so I don't think it's a worthwhile direction for us to go in. But it does speak to the way in which leaving the Manchester School was terribly difficult, it seems, or that break was difficult on both sides. And there's some correspondence between Gluckman and Turner, which Dick cites here after they've met, and Turner is making the break with Gluckman and the Manchester School in part by accusing Gluckman of not allowing him to carry out analysis of a ritual at a time when he wanted to do it and in the way in which he wanted to do it. And this seems, in terms of the record as Dick reconstitutes it, in fact to be unfair. And in this correspondence, Gluckman reproaches Turner, saying, "I must frankly say that it was both unfair and ungrateful to myself, Elizabeth Colson and Clyde Mitchell as your teachers, for you to publish such a statement, as well as not the truth," which seems to me that speaks to a certain sort of community where you first point out that it's unfair and ungrateful, and then you say, oh, and by the way, it's also not true. Turner responds in a very aggrieved tone, saying, "I grieved that almost all my words and work seem to rouse your ire these days. When I see a letter from Manchester, I flinch from opening it." So clearly the breakdown is not just an intellectual one, but at an emotional level, quite a traumatic one, which is why it's so important for Dick to look at these events as they unfold in a sequence. Now, I haven't got time, without squeezing out everyone's chance to ask some questions of the author, to go into too much detail about the reanalysis of Chihamba. Also, given lockdown, I didn't have the advantage of managing to get into a library to get hold of the original, so I've only reread Dick's account rather than being able to look at that against the original of Turner's account. Turner's account, although it was published in a hardback in 1975, was originally a Rhodes Livingston paper that came out in 1962. And so it belongs to that period, which Dick is identifying as the most sort of representatively Manchester period of Vic Turner's work. but it's at a period when Vic Turner is kind of going over to the dark side in Werbnerian terms, because the way in which Turner analyzes Chihamba is to look in great detail at a lot of the symbols, a lot of what by now he's looking at as a ritual drama. So part of the transition he's making is from analyzing social drama, analyzing ritual within a social drama, to analyzing something that is more intrinsically ritual drama with its social context diminished to a large extent, which Dick is not sympathetic to, as I read it. And what Dick does in his reanalysis is to take an initial ethnography, which is, I understand it, I haven't been able to go back and check again, is mostly set out in terms of the symbols, the rites, the things that go on at particular stages of this 3-day event, and he reconstitutes it in terms of its sequencing, and finds that very important. And the sequencing has a second day, which has all the characteristics which Turner should have recognized as being liminal had he attended as closely as he might have done to Max Gluckman's interest in Van Gennep's rites of passage, which is something Dick is saying Turner hasn't really absorbed at this stage. And when he does, he takes it on much more as a binary than as a triad. So in the later works, the structure, communitas and liminality become a binary sort of distinction. And the influence of, and here we start talking about kind of projection, and I suppose takes me back to that idea about presentiment. The presentiment that Turner brings to all of this comes from his Catholicism and Thomism, and it depends upon analyzing this particular rite, and especially its culmination, as an act of being in which the identity and the essence of Kavula, who is sort of the sub-deity who is involved in all of this, is shown to be elusive. What the initiates and the participants are shown at the end is an emptiness, not a plenitude. And so Turner gets to the point of saying what it demonstrates is not the unsayable, but the unsayability of what lies at the existential heart, the essential heart of these kinds of rituals. And what Dick's doing, being mischievous, is saying that what it really deals with is not something that's unsayable, but mostly with a whole series of things but are not very sayable in polite company. And so he looks at the phallic symbolism of the male and female symbols involved. He looks at the mimed sexual intercourse, which occurs at various points within the drama, and the fact that the participants, rather than being engaged in an act of being, for much of the rite at least, finding it hysterically funny, and it probably is. And what I think Dick is telling us is that Turner has failed to grasp what strikes a lot of people in the midst of extended African rituals, that there is an extraordinary ambivalence of tone to them, that things can be simultaneously comic and tragic and violent and dominating and liberating, and all at the same time, or if not at the same time, at least sequentially. And therefore, you have to look at things sequentially if you want to begin to understand what's going on. Now, I could talk at rather great length about these because there are an awful lot of different symbols that get analysed in all of this. But what struck me, to go back to where I came in, was by the time I'd read the two chapters together, I understood why he did it. Because the apparent anomaly of this penultimate chapter, which is a case study, isn't really an anomaly at all. The Vic Turner biography is sort of the abstract case for the prosecution, seen in processual terms, and what we get in Chihamba is the prosecutor's evidence of what's going on. So anyway, I salute you for that, Dick. I haven't responded to your invitation to talk about Mary Douglas and her perception of the Manchester School. But what I can tell you is that in the early 1970s, when I listened to her lectures, she lectured with extraordinary engagement and enthusiasm about the case studies from Turner and Mitchell on disputes within villages and the way in which village fishing occurred and so forth. And those were terribly important to the grid and group type analysis that Adam was talking about earlier. And I think her main disappointment with the Manchester School was that it appeared that, maybe this goes back to the gendered aspect that Adam was speaking about earlier, it appeared to her that they simply didn't take any notice of her. They didn't read her book. They never reviewed her book. And she felt that, and maybe you'll want to respond to this, that the Manchester School were profoundly ignorant of those parts of Central Africa which weren't British colonial possessions. They were really weak on the ethnography that was being written up in neighbouring French Central Africa, and they didn't basically read those books, and therefore they had in her view, a poor grasp of some of the regional history, not of Central Southern Africa, but as you went a bit further north than that. Anyway, Dick, comrade, I salute you for having completed this. Thank you for the invitation, and I now look forward to your telling us briefly why we're all wrong in our responses to your book. But well done.
Thank you very much, Professor Fardon, for that fascinating response. I will now, ask Professor Werbner to respond for about 5 minutes, and then we take question and answer, if that is possible.
Thank you. I'll try to be quick. First of all, I think that Adam has stuck to something that he's deeply committed to, which is masculinity. And it doesn't worry me in the same way in relation to the Manchester School. I think that Elizabeth Colson was a very, very significant, not marginal factor, and that her connection as a broker between British anthropology, British even sociology, and American was very, very important. And if one looks at the writings that some of the people in Berkeley had about it, you get a different perspective on it entirely. So I, who got my first introduction to the Manchester School from her by going to Boston University and sitting for a good afternoon when she explained to me who and what the people really were, I continued for decades to be very close to her, and I have a debt to her that I acknowledge. And I think that she was a most important successor to Max. And Max, I was going to say adored, but maybe that's inadequate. He respected and listened to her very carefully. And it isn't just a legend that when she unraveled her ball of twine while knitting, she tangled him up and held him under control in her own way. So we could argue about this, and we could also argue about the leftism, the extent to which, when you look at some of these people like Bill Epstein and even Clyde himself, who was very deeply committed to an anti-colonial stance, but he wasn't a simple lefty like Peter Worsley or Ronnie Frankenberg, and the same goes for Epstein. So they were much more varied. So my response to your very strong and appreciated treatment is to say, your narrative is unitary and mine is plural. And that's where the interest that I have in writing this, to get at the diversity and the extent to which these people managed to live together through dissension. So I wouldn't agree with that. Now, I'm very grateful to Sakkie for reconstructing for us the South African context, which is part of making Max somebody very, very aware of change and of the deep conflicts in the society from which he came to. And part of this comes out when he tries to defend himself in relation to Vic Turner later on, because he writes to Vic, you say that in these things you've been publishing that we were serving the government there by getting labor migration statistics and the rest of it. And he said, but how could I have come from South Africa and not been aware of all of these problems of labor migration and make the kind of plan for research that he did? So I think it's very important that, Sakkie, you bring this out. And I did try to explain what sort of a role model Max had in his barrister father, who set the stage for research in Botswana, I'm happy to say, to such an extent that he's described by historians later on as a human rights lawyer who really fought for human rights for people. Now, Marilyn, of course, some of you may know that I am a colleague who always felt that the occasion I had to go and see her to report on what I'd done was the liberating experience of the year. And so I'm most grateful to Marilyn for the insights into the transformation that went on with Bill. And I then have to put a plug, because she's given me the chance to do so. Having indeed come upon Bill's affect work and earlier worked on it in the project that I submitted for publication that Pnina co-authored with me, we attend very, very much to Bill Epstein's turn to affect. And it really did make it possible. And I see this is a real question that time is not linear for us. But we do have this recursion and turning back. And I'm grateful to Marilyn for pointing that out. Finally, I'll come briefly to what my comrade in name and in spirit, Richard, and he's quite right to call me Dick, makes the point from Steiner about presentiment and complexity of it. The only thing I would add to what he said so sharply and acutely is that working on Vic's life in America opened my eyes to celebrity. And it's the problem of celebrity, not the leaving of Manchester and all the rest of it, that bedevils the life that Vic Turner had. And we who now have, as Americanized speak, have had a celebrity instead of a competent president and person in governance, know what celebrity can do. And I think myself that celebrity was the undoing of Vic Turner. And that's what I try to show. And I do think that he kept on living in this world of Ndembu as it had been, or as he thought of it at that time. And remember that he was not one person, as I try to show. He was two people. And the other person was the daughter of a vicar who herself never changed in some ways through all the transformations. So he had a wife who did a lot of the hard practical work and allowed him to think and write his stories and so on. And when the account is properly worked out, we will have another version of what it is to be one and two people at the same time.
Thank you very much. I think Sakkie wants to quickly respond. Please. You have to unmute.
Not necessary, no.
Okay, all right. Okay, thank you. I got some messages from some people that they would love Rob Gordon to respond. Is Rob happy to respond now? While waiting for him, because we are actually pressed for time, I have a question here from Thomas Erickson. Could anyone comment on how the anthropologists